Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's presentation, author series, Rome, Wild Animals and the Race to Repair Our Fractured World is brought to you by award-winning environmental reporter Hillary Rosner and NatHab's Senior Editorial Manager Rachel Walker. Thank you for being here today, Hillary and Rachel. Over to you.
Thanks, Brooke. Hi, Hillary. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me here. I'm so happy to be here.
I am too. So I'm gonna show your book, your beautiful book, that just came out in October. Is that right?
Yeah, just a few weeks ago.
Just a few weeks ago. And I thought that before we launched into talking about the book, it might be helpful if you would read a couple paragraphs from the book to get us grounded.
Yes, absolutely. So I will start pretty much at the beginning, the introduction. All right, introduction, The Adventures of Lucky Pierre. At the tail end of the 20th century, when I was living in the engineered asphalt ecosystem of Manhattan, a coyote made its way into Central Park. It was April Fool's Day of all things, and the incident had the vague whiff of a prank. Helicopters searched the ground from above, while a throng of cops and animal welfare workers chased the coyote across the park's landmarks, from the skating rink to the Great Lawn to a nature sanctuary, and finally a World War I statue, where the bedraggled animal collapsed, having been hit by a tranquilizer dart as he tried to dodge his pursuers by swimming across a pond. The coyote, whom authorities at first nicknamed Lucky Pierre after the Pierre Hotel on nearby Fifth Avenue, was ultimately renamed Otis and sent to live in a half-acre enclosure in the Queens Zoo, where he lived in a pack of renegade coyotes captured in various places unsanctioned by humans. At the time, park officials noted that coyotes had become an increasing presence in New York City, particularly in the Bronx, but they weren't certain how this one had arrived in the center of Manhattan. They speculated that he had trotted over the Henry Hudson Bridge, which connects Manhattan to the Bronx, but how he navigated the concrete canyons of the Upper West Side was a mystery. I grew up in those same concrete canyons and had returned after college to work as a journalist, and I was transfixed by the idea that there might be ribbons of green spaces through which a reasonably large mammal could travel in such a heavily urban area, like a highway, but for animals. I had spent a good chunk of my childhood traipsing around Central Park, and now I looked at the place in a new way. I was fascinated that this manicured, purpose-built, fake natural place could host wild creatures beyond rats and squirrels and the odd pond turtle. Otis was my first intellectual encounter with the notion of wildlife corridors.
I love that. I love it's so sensory and such a great putting us in a sense of place and really describing the contrast between the urban landscape and the green corridor within it. And your book really delves deep into this idea of wildlife corridors and connectivity and what it means for species around the globe, right? So I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about the overarching premise and theme of Rome and tell us a little bit more about what connectivity means and why it's important.
Yeah, sure. So so that introduction is kind of just one little glimpse of a kind of connectivity, which is this idea of a wildlife corridor. But I wanted to sort of capture this broader notion. And so there is actually a scientific definition for connectivity, which is something like the unimpeded movement of animals and flow of natural processes that sustains life on Earth. So that's kind of the scientific definition. But what that means on the ground is that, animals need to move in their daily lives, the same as we need to move in our daily lives. And unfortunately, we humans have engineered the planet such that it works for humans, but not really for most other species on Earth. And so if you think about all of our infrastructure and all of the ways that we have changed the literal face of the Earth, most of those things are barriers to wildlife. So you can think about a city, a highway, a fence, a border wall, industrial scale agriculture, on and on and on. All of these things are barriers to animal movement. And so connectivity is this idea of like how we can remove those barriers, or how we can make the planet navigable for all the other species that we share it with. And just to like give you a sense of the scale of how we reshape the planet, just like a couple of little tidbits. Less than 15% of land around the world is protected from development, and most of those chunks of land are not connected to one another. 600,000 miles of fencing covers the American West, and that does not include property fencing in cities and suburbs. So that's a landscape that we think of as being wide open, but in fact it is covered in fences. Urban areas around the world increased 80% in the last 3 decades and are projected to grow by 600% more this century. By 2050, the roads covering the planet could be 1,000 times the Earth's circumference. And if you drove those at 60 miles an hour, it would take 45 years of nonstop driving to cover them. And I mean, I could go on, but you know, we have really like reshaped the planet, and so this creates all kinds of problems for animals. And so the book is kind of just about trying to answer this question, like how can we reconnect the planet so that non-human species can move as they need to? And that movement isn't just for species, although of course that is incredibly important, because if animals can't move around to access what they need, then they can go extinct. But it's also about us, because wildlife movement, in fact, is connected to all of these other ecological processes. And so it's really in everyone's interest on this planet to have wildlife be able to move a little bit more freely once again.
Talk a little bit more about that. I mean, at the risk of asking a very obvious question, why is it important? Like, why is this fracturing and this parceling of wild places so detrimental to on a big sort of global scale, but also on an individual species scale?
Yeah, well, so I mean, on the individual species scale, if an individual animal cannot move to access like the food that it needs, say, like that animal could die. And if that happens enough, then a whole species could die. Also, if you slap down a road in the middle of habitat, you are sort of bisecting the population. So now you have 2 different populations of this species that can't interbreed. And so you get this huge loss of genetic diversity. And over time, that makes that species less resilient to disease and all kinds of things. And so that also can be a kind of extinction vortex or road to extinction. Then on a just broader scale, animals play a huge role in ecological processes and ecosystem functioning. And so if you take a species out of an ecosystem, that ecosystem can unravel. And that, of course, also has ripple effects. And so those are some of the kinds of connectivity I think about in the book. Like I think about linear connectivity, which is just this like species needing to get from point A to point B. I think about ecological connectivity, which is having these like intact ecosystems that, that are like can actually recover from, that are resilient and can recover from change. And then I think about something called umbilical connectivity, which is really our human connection to nature, which is incredibly important on many different levels. And then there's also other kinds of connectivity, which I didn't necessarily think about when I first started writing the book, but that ended up playing a role. So there's like an idea of hidden connectivity. So I have a chapter where I write about the Everglades and this idea of how the water that's kind of like percolating underground actually connects systems and has a huge impact on what wildlife can live where. So there's this hidden connectivity. And then also there's a kind of connectivity that's sort of about how our human decisions and like the way we treat each other socially, like social justice, racial justice, actually impacts the other species with whom we share our spaces, particularly in urban areas.
That's fascinating.
That was a lot.
Is there, I mean, that's so much. I mean, it's such an enormous topic with, it's almost like a hub and spoke model in some ways. There's so many threads that you could unravel when you're that you don't unravel them, but that you approach in your book, and that you do a really good job of delving into and explaining in a lot of detail. I'm curious about the concept, sort of like the popular understanding, the mainstream understanding of connectivity. Is that some, can you kind of walk me through the timeline a little bit? I obviously, when at some point this became a more known problem, the disruption of different ecosystems and the bifurcation of land and the impact on species. And so when, how would you categorize, I guess, the collective awareness of the importance of connectivity, and how has that evolved over the years? Like, how did we get to this situation where we have all these statistics that you just told us, and get to this problem? And at what point did some scientists and activists, when did people say, hey, wait a minute, this can't continue
Yeah.
like?
Yeah, well, so I mean, I think the problem, just like how we got here, is just that, we just kind of went about our business trying to make things better for humans, right? Like that's really what it's all about. Like we tried to make life more convenient and better in many ways for human beings. And we did that in this very piecemeal way where, oh, I'm just going to pave over this. I'm just going to pave over that. I'm just going to build this road. I'm just going to, cut down all the trees and build this, industrial scale farm. And then it just like those things actually connect to one another, right? Like, it's just like death by 1,000 cuts. And so I think that's how we got to where we are without any kind of like long-term planning on regional scales, on global scales, like all around the world. I think about like where we live in Colorado, like, there was very little kind of regional scale planning. And so you just kind of chip away, and then suddenly you have this problem. As far as the science, I mean, back in the 1960s was when the biologists E.O. Wilson and Robert MacArthur came up with this idea of island biogeography, which was a way to explain how species were distributed around the world. And that sort of led to, like, you could think about fragmented habitat as islands. And so this idea about like extinction rates and how like when you slice up an ecosystem, leaving these disconnected fragments, those fragments function like islands. And so populations become vulnerable, and they're more vulnerable to all kinds of threats and ultimately extinction. And then there was kind of following that, like a whole field of conservation biology that studied this in various ways. One of the most interesting ecological experiments in connectivity was run by Thomas Lovejoy, who passed away a couple of years ago, in the Amazon. And he basically, he kind of created these islands of habitat in the sea of deforestation. He created these fragments of 2.5, 25, and 250 acre fragments in this sea of deforestation that was taking place. And he found that even in the largest plots of 250 acres, they were much too small for some species to survive. And this was because of the interactions between species. So there's a great one, which I talk about in the book, where in these larger plots, within 15 years, half of the bird species had vanished. Black spider monkeys disappeared from the forest fragments. Those monkeys, they move quickly through large areas of forest and they eat from the trees. They couldn't do that, like these trees that are spaced far apart, because there just weren't enough of them. Ant birds disappeared, and these birds exist in a symbiotic relationship with army ants. So they follow these kind of invading columns of army ants. And they, like the bugs that flee from the army ants, the birds eat. But there wasn't enough space for the army ants. And so the army ants disappeared, the birds disappeared. And so suddenly you had these like empty forest fragments. And that was like really eye-opening to learn that, like, even in these like bigger chunks of fragmented forest, the animals couldn't survive.
So what led you to want to write about this massive topic? And tell me a little bit more about the genesis of the book. I know, actually, let's start with your journalism. I mean, I'm assuming you probably were writing about these issues long before you decided to write a book about it.
Yeah, definitely. So I've definitely been, I've been doing journalism for a very long time. I had been writing stories about biodiversity and conservation, and I just started noticing that like the ones that really caught my attention were always in some way about this declining ability to roam. And so that like it was on my mind. And then in I think 2018, this big study came out that found that all over the world, in places where humans had like a larger footprint, mammal species were moving less, and by a lot. And so then I thought, okay, like I really, there's something here, and I really want to write about that. And what I did was I set out. I didn't want to write this like depressing book about all of this stuff, having just thrown out all these statistics. What I wanted to write about is the people that were working on solutions. How can we, like, all hope is not lost. How can we knit the planet back together again so that species can roam as they need to? And I don't, I'm not naive. Like, I don't think that we're going to have a planet where like, there's just like a jaguar roaming through my backyard or something. But obviously we have massively altered the planet. We have this gigantic human civilization, but how can we better coexist with the species that we live among and who we lived among for millennia? And how can we sort of take what is here and find ways to fix it? And how can we just make better decisions going forward?
I love the idea of roam too, because it connotes so much almost whimsy. I mean, it's very not human oriented.
Why is that? Why don't humans need to roam more, I think, also. I mean, I guess we used to.
Purposeful. Everything has to have a point, whereas these animals are just following their instinct. I mean, it's a great title for the book. Okay, so I love it that you wanted to find the people working on solutions and I love that phrase, knitting the planet back together. Talk to us a little bit about how you went about organizing this book and what goes into, I mean, this book is so far reaching and you go to so many different places. And so maybe you can start by telling our audience a little bit about some of the places you went to, what captured your interest, why you picked them, and then even just peek behind the curtain a little bit, like how does a journalist find the sources in Italy, for example?
Yeah, sure. Well, so when I first started thinking about the book, I was thinking very much in terms of like linear connectivity and ecological connectivity. These were like the two big sort of buckets that I was thinking in. And so I knew about some stories. I had sources that I had already written about in various places. So I went back to some of them and said, like, I'm thinking about writing this book, and what are you working on, or what's going on here? And like, themes started to emerge. And the more I talked to people, the more I sort of found out about different kinds of connectivity that I wasn't thinking about. And so I decided to structure the book thematically. So I wanted to like deal with all these different kinds of connectivity. And so, for instance, like one of them, it's easy to understand the concept of connectivity, like when you're talking about a terrestrial animal, right? Like you can see like, oh, this panther has to cross this highway, but it can't because there's traffic on the highway. But I was really interested in animals that fly. And so I really wanted to have a chapter about birds and connectivity with birds. And so I started like just calling up like, bird person after bird person, like this person from Audubon. And, I just started like, went down this rabbit hole interviewing bird researchers because I really wanted to have a chapter on birds. And as it turned out, like none of the projects, like nothing worked out in terms of timing or like, I just couldn't find like the right bird project. But instead, I actually have a chapter about bats. Which were nowhere on my radar when I first started thinking about this. But so I have this chapter about bats that's about this migratory bat called the Mexican long-nosed bat, which is endangered. It migrates between Mexico and the southwestern United States, and it's a nectar-feeding bat. and it feeds these pregnant female bats, move north. They fly north, and they surf this highway of agave nectar the whole way. And so that's what they feed on. Like that is what they need 100%. They need this agave nectar. But like so much else, these landscapes are changing. The agaves are disappearing. You know,
Well,
urban
you even make a
development.
point in that chapter that even where the agave is not, like where there's commercial agave, it's not sustaining the bats.
Yeah, well, right, because the problem with commercial agave is that like they harvest them before they flower. So agaves are these plants that they flower once in their lifetime. It can take 10 to 15 years for a single agave to flower. They grow these like enormous stalks that rise up and produce like this plethora of flowers, and then like all of these species rely on them. And so these landscapes are disappearing, which is bad for the bats. And so I wrote about this project that a nonprofit called Bat Conservation International is doing, where they're working with these remote desert communities in northern Mexico that are also struggling because of this prolonged drought that is completely changing the landscapes where they live and making it very, very hard to continue to earn a living by farming and ranching, which is what they traditionally did. And so this organization is helping the people who live in these communities stay on the land by providing them with you know, kind of diverse, sustainable ways to make a living. And in exchange, these farmers in these communities are helping replant agaves out on the landscape for these bats. And so it was just a cool kind of like win-win situation. Right. It's this community-based conservation. It's working with the people who like know the land and know the area, and it's forging these connections between humans and bats. And so that was, you know, so that's kind of how I ended up with that chapter, because I was just actually looking for a story about birds.
Well, why was it so important to you to have a chapter on flying animals?
Well, because I think that, so we often don't, it's hard to imagine, like, why does connectivity matter to a species that flies in the air? But of course, those species need resources down on the ground. And like migratory flying species, like some bats and birds, are really in a lot of trouble because they cover so much ground, and their life cycle involves so many different locations on the ground in different places. And so we might be doing like everything right here in Colorado for this one particular bird species, but that species migrates to Argentina, and in Argentina there's a pesticide that's being applied that's like killing them all. So right. It's just, it connects these like landscapes over time, and I thought that was really fascinating and wanted to illustrate that. And the bats are a similar thing. They connect like these huge areas.
That makes a lot of sense. One of our trips at NatHab is the monarch migration, and with the wintering monarchs in the Mexican highlands, and that's something that we write about a lot, is just how important it is to sustain. I mean, like you just said, it's these broad stretches. I mean, they travel 3,000 miles, and their survival depends on having healthy ecosystems the entire way, because otherwise they won't
exactly.
make it. Yeah.
Exactly.
What about you, just from a writing perspective and a craft perspective, how did you manage to do all of your research and keep it organized? Were you working really closely with your editor? How did you decide how to structure the book? And what was your writing process like?
I wasn't really working closely with anyone like along the way. I definitely struggled like along the way trying to find like certain stories that I knew that I wanted to write about, and try to find the right story. Like I had like themes that I wanted to write about. I needed a place and a species that was sort of exciting and interesting and compelling, and also like people that are compelling. Like I wanted to write about people who were great characters and had interesting stories to tell, and were willing to kind of let me come and like ask a lot of silly questions and like take me along with them. And so the people who I write about in the book ultimately are so, they were so generous with their time. And, you know, that was a big thing. So, yeah, so I was kind of like just doing it on my own. Like I had this idea of these stories that I wanted to tell. I would go do a ton of reporting, find the story, go report it, come back, try to write that chapter. And then I sort of had to like kind of string them all together at, later on. And there were a lot of themes that came up in multiple places that I hadn't been really thinking about. So like I saw the same issues come up, like the importance of private lands conservation in addition to public lands conservation. Like that was a theme that came up in the American West. It came up in Costa Rica. It came up in Italy. It just came up in a lot of different places where I went in Kenya. Just the importance of working with people to keep private lands open, privately owned lands open for wildlife as well.
One of the things that I loved about your book is how much you were a character in all of the chapters, in a really organic way. It's like you took the reader along on the journey. And I wanted to ask you about your own evolution. How did you go from being a kid who grew up in the concrete canyons of New York City to being an environmental journalist who gets to travel around the globe reporting on these fascinating stories?
How did I? Well, so I had sort of shunned science throughout my childhood. I mean, I was like, my family did like go, we went out into nature and I spent summers in the woods and stuff like that. But I never really liked science, and I didn't really pursue it in high school and college. And then I moved back to New York after college and I started my career as a journalist. And I don't know what happened, but I just suddenly got really, really interested in environmental issues. Climate change was just like coming on the radar, and deforestation was becoming like big news. And I just got really, really interested in all this stuff and like fascinated by these, places that just seemed like so foreign and so far away. Like I couldn't imagine what it would be like to set foot in a rainforest. But ultimately, I decided that was what I wanted to write about. I decided I wanted to be an environmental and science journalist, and I thought if that was the case, I better get some science background. And so I moved to Boulder, and I did a master's in environmental studies at CU Boulder, and I spent several years just like totally like diving in, immersed in like conservation biology and ecology and environmental law and soil science and just all of this stuff. And then I kind of sort of emerged ready to cover science journalism. But I do feel I have always felt like I don't fit in either world. Like I don't quite fit in the New York urban world, and I don't quite fit in the like, tropical rainforest researcher world.
Why not?
I don't know. I don't know. Like I'm not New Yorky enough for the New York world, and I'm not like hardcore enough for the tropical researcher world.
But you can translate between those two worlds. I mean, that's a pretty important role, is to have somebody who can go in and be the bridge, be the connector, the connectivity. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the chapters that I wanted to talk about Costa Rica and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem if we have time, because these are two places that we have trips to at NatHab. And one of the places you write about in your Costa Rica chapter is the Osa Peninsula and what's happening there. And before this webinar started, we were chatting a little bit about Costa Rica's diversity and how important it is for its biodiversity, but also how compact the country is and some of the issues there. So can you talk a little bit, tell our audience about what you were looking at in Costa Rica and what you were reporting on?
Yeah, so Costa Rica was such an interesting story. So one of the things that I really wanted to write about in the book was the intersection of land use change and climate change. And so one reason why it's such a big problem that that there's so many barriers to wildlife movement is because as the climate changes, many species around the planet are going to have to move some distance to access the resources that they need, which will no longer be available in the place where they currently live. And this becomes a problem when we've set aside all these protected areas, but now those protected areas change and no longer have the resources that the species they were protected for need. And so On the Osa Peninsula of Costa Rica, Corcovado National Park is kind of like the crown jewel of Costa Rican biodiversity. It contains 5% of the planet's biodiversity, which is kind of astonishing. But it's only 105,000 acres. And then I think a little bit more, that's the land area. There's a little bit more of marine conservation there. And just to visualize that, you could fit more than 20 Corcovado National Parks inside of Yellowstone National Park. So it's really tiny. And so there's two issues. One is that as with many national parks around the world, it's not actually big enough to contain and sustain the species that live there. It's been very well protected, and so the wildlife there is thriving, but now that wildlife needs more land. And then on top of that, as the climate changes, some of those species will need to move up in elevation in order to access the resources that they need. There are the Talamanca Mountains nearby. There's a big protected area there up in elevation. But in between Corcovado on the Osa Peninsula and the Talamanca Mountains, which are on the Panama border, is the Central Valley, which is like farms and roads and all kinds of development. And so this small nonprofit called Osa Conservation, which is just doing incredible work, has this program called Ridge to Reef. And they are trying to create these corridors that connect all the way from the sea up to these mountains at higher elevations, so that there are pathways that wildlife can move through. And so I went down there and I was looking at some of the work that they're doing. I mean, it involves a lot of different things. It involves planting trees in the highlands, like reforesting different areas. Tree planting is like a very tricky thing. There's a lot of like bad tree planting efforts. They're trying to do it right, where they actually like work with the landowners to make sure they're planting trees where they want and what they want. And they're trying to like actually take care of the trees instead of just planting them and then leaving.
That was one of my favorite, the way you wrote about that was really illustrative for me when you talk about regrowing a rainforest and the time and effort. I didn't have any appreciation for how hard it is for tree planting to be an actual effective solution.
Yeah. I mean, I think people don't. It's just become this thing like, oh, like do a carbon offset, plant a tree, right? But like, it's not just about planting a tree and leaving. Like, you have to tend that tree and make sure that it's not being like eaten by herbivores, and make sure that it actually stays there, and make sure that the land you're planting it on isn't some place where somebody's going to come down next year and cut it down. And then you have to plant a mix of species so that some things go quickly and some, it's a whole thing, and you need fruit trees. And so they're trying to do this really intentionally, thinking about like the actual species that will move through here and what they need, and working with landowners. And so that was really cool. And then they have a whole host of other really interesting conservation efforts that are going on there. And they're all run by this really amazing guy named Andy Whitworth, who is he comes from Northern England, and he has this like great kind of Manchester accent. And he is just this amazing character. He's so wonderful and warm, and like has just devoted his entire life to tropical conservation, partly because he grew up, his father owned a pet store in Manchester when he was a kid, and it sort of dawned on him as a teenager that like some of these species were, probably shouldn't be people's pets, and maybe weren't acquired in the most kosher way. And so I think he felt like he says now he has to do penance in a tropical forest for the rest of his life. But anyway, he's just this like font of knowledge and works with all these local communities. And yeah, that was really fun to sort of hear about what they're doing there.
There were a lot of individuals in your book who have a role like the one that Andy plays. And when in the course of your reporting, did you find, I mean, clearly they work with a team, right? Like it can't just be one person driving an initiative, but how individual driven was a lot of the conservation work that you wrote about, and how dependent was it on one person's vision and drive and ability to raise funds and manage projects?
I think a lot of it is really driven by these conservation heroes in different places. I mean, I was really struck when I traveled to all these different places at how many volunteers there were, like how many people were just like giving their time and working for free and just putting in like a lot of this stuff is hard work, like whether it's like, working under the hot sun with wire cutters, like taking down obsolete barbed wire fencing in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, or whether it's like sweltering in the hot sun in Costa Rica, like climbing trees and putting up these like monkey bridges, and all over, like in Italy, these volunteers were like they were locating and finding these holes in the ground that were like these remnant wells from hundreds of years ago that this endangered species of bear was falling into, and they were trying to find these wells that weren't on any maps, and then they would have these grates made by this local fabricator, and then they would like carry these like giant metal grates across, like again, like in the sweltering sun, like across these huge areas, and then like drill these things, and like it's all just like hard manual labor. And there were just so many people who were doing this, whether it was college students or whoever, like who had sort of decided this was what they wanted to do instead of like working for a hedge fund or something. And so like it was just, I was really impressed with that. But all of these projects had a champion, and I think that's how this stuff gets done.
Did you find a common thread among the volunteers? I mean, were they generally young, or were they really, I don't know, idealistic? Were they really science-based? Who were these people, and were they happy to be interviewed? What did they think of your project?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these places, a lot of these smaller nonprofits that I wrote about have these kind of like internships or fellowship programs, or these like, kind of short-term, like 3-month volunteer programs that anyone really can go do. They definitely tended to be younger, the volunteers. They were, sometimes it was people who had to like, they needed like an internship to graduate from college or something, but they certainly didn't have to be doing it in the rainforest. Like I think these were people who really felt like they wanted to be out in the world, out in the natural world, learning about stuff, doing things with their hands, like just doing like hands-on stuff that was actually helping.
That's
and
really cool.
It's very like, I think those were also like the most hopeful people. Like all of the people who were actually working and doing something were hopeful, because they were there. They were like trying to help. Like they got up every day and they were like, I'm gonna protect this species. I'm gonna save this little piece of the planet. And it was actually really inspiring to write about. Like people have asked me like, oh, wasn't it sort of depressing to write about this? It's such a tough topic. And it was. Like there were definitely, some of it is hard, but also like it was really hopeful.
And you were also, I mean, involved in doing a lot of that hands-on. I feel like you were thirsty a lot in the book. You talked about drinking a lot of your water.
That's really funny. I did. I reread some stuff recently, and I was like, wow, I really do talk a lot about being thirsty.
I mean, it's a legitimate state of being, right? And you're out there under, like you said, under the hot sun working. And it sounded too like you brought your family, at least to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Were they with you when you were removing fences?
They were not with me when I was removing fences. They were there. Well, they were there, but they didn't. Okay. They weren't working. They were lounging while I was removing fences in the hot sun, being thirsty.
Well, tell us a little more about the fence removal. And, at the beginning of our conversation, you talked about the 600,000 acres of fencing in the American West. And I think it's such a good lead in, I guess, to the whole public-private landscape. So tell us a little bit about the problem of fencing and what that means in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem.
Sure. Well, so I mean, so when we talk about something like the human footprint, there's something called the Human Footprint Index, and this is like it's a measure of like how much impact humans have had on the landscape. And so if you think about like, oh, well, what would have a high human footprint index? Like you would think about something like New York City, right? Like it's radically changed. And if you think about the opposite of that, you might think about the American West and like these wide open sprawling areas. But in fact, much of the American West is covered in fencing. And barbed wire fencing. And that is a problem for some species, not for other species, but it creates a problem for a lot of migratory species. These fences are barriers. And some of this fencing is obsolete. Like, it is not being used for anything. It's not being used to keep cattle off a road. It's not being used to hold something in or keep something out. It's just there because somebody put it there 100 years ago, and it's really expensive and labor intensive to take down. And so there are these efforts, like the one I volunteered with, which was run by something called the Evsarka Fence Initiative, where they have these volunteer days, and ranchers who have fencing that they want to take down can kind of say, like, hey, come to my property. And so they get all these volunteers, and they go, and everybody comes out with like wire cutters and big heavy gloves, and like often it involves like untangling fencing from like sagebrush that it's grown, that's grown up with it. And they remove this fencing and kind of open up the landscape. And so I participated in one of these.
The one that you participated in, it sounded like the landowner wanted to remain anonymous. And I was wondering about that. Was there any sort of controversy around this, or was it just somebody didn't want any extra acknowledgement? Like, is this
I don't know. I really don't know. They just didn't want to call attention to themselves. I'm not really sure why. I don't think there's anything controversial about it, but I don't know. They just didn't want to draw attention to themselves. So they were very happy to have me come and participate and talk to everyone, but they just didn't want me to mention the name of that property.
That's legitimate. But I mean, it does.
I was just gonna say, what it shows is that, like people flock to Yellowstone every year to go there and see, among other things, like the charismatic megafauna, right? Like, that's a big draw. But I think a lot of people don't recognize that if you want to have those species in Yellowstone, you also need to protect landscapes outside of Yellowstone, because some of those species they don't see the borders of the park. They can't read lines on a map, and they need resources that exist outside the park. And so if you want to have these species in the park, you have to protect the lands outside the park, most of which are privately owned, like these huge working ranches. And there's there's a monetary incentive now for ranchers who are getting older to sell off and subdivide these parcels of land as a way to make money to fund their retirement. And so some of what I wrote about in the book were some really innovative projects to try to create ways for ranchers to make a living, or to get an influx of money from habitat conservation. Unfortunately,
different though than land trusts, right? This is
different than land trusts. Yeah. So this is so these were they're called habitat leases, and they were all different. They were like very much like tailored to what do you, the specific rancher, need and want, and how can we find a way to pay you for keeping this habitat open for wildlife in a way that makes sense for you. And so they were these really innovative programs. Unfortunately, I don't know if they're, some of them have been cut already, some of them are being cut, which is unfortunate also because they had like huge bipartisan support. So some of it was just like being able to pay ranchers more than this sort of standard for providing wildlife forage, right? So we recognize like elk are grazing your land, and that means you have less land for your cattle to graze. So we are going to actually pay you for providing that service for these elk to graze on your land.
And who sort of sets the economic value of that? How do they determine the?
It's the USDA, so it's USDA programs. It started out, I can't remember what that particular program is called off the top of my head, but it's one of the like USDA conservation programs, and it actually started. It came up in the Midwest, so it's a program that started in like Iowa that they adapted for the West. And one of the ways that they did this was to provide this like higher sort of conservation per acre fee for ranchers, so that it actually like can help them survive and they don't have to sell off their land.
That's amazing. Wow. Well, I'm looking at the time. I had a couple more questions I wanted to ask you, but I think I'm going to jump ahead. And if people, I love what you said about the people who were the most hopeful were the people who were actually on the ground volunteering. If somebody wanted to, in addition to buying your book and reading about the amazing organizations doing work around the world, what advice do you have for people who want to get involved in this issue of connectivity and learn more about wildlife corridors and maybe volunteer?
Well, I mean, to start with, so there is actually a resource with the book. There's like a QR code in the book that takes you, it actually just takes you to the book's page on Patagonia's website. Yeah, so if you scan that QR code, it takes you to the product page on Patagonia. And if you scroll down, there is a little box with some links, and one of them, I forget what the exact wording is, but it basically says like for a list of organizations that are mentioned in the book. And so there are all the websites of the organizations that I write about. So OSA Conservation, for instance, like their website would be there. And so some of those places might have volunteer opportunities for people who want to go and travel there. So that might be a starting point.
We didn't tell our audience, the book is published by Patagonia Books. I should have mentioned that at the beginning, which is so interesting, and they have such a cool publishing house. Can you briefly talk a little bit about the experience of publishing with Patagonia?
Yeah, I mean, it's been great. They've been really, they've been great to work with. They are, they're mission driven, and so they have like this interest in publishing books that align with their mission. And so, they didn't like interfere editorially in any way, but obviously this book aligns with their mission. And so it was a great fit. They've been like super supportive. They put lots of, they have a whole photo team. And so they put lots of photos in the book, which I think is cool and makes it
so beautiful.
more fun to read. It's like full of photos.
Yeah, no, it's gorgeous. It's really a beautiful book, and obviously really well written. But
thank you.
What about I mean, obviously it's such a complex topic, as we've discussed over this past conversation, 40 minutes, but if you have takeaways, or not just one necessarily singular one, but what are your parting thoughts, I guess, or how for that book, like having immersed yourself in this really complicated topic and talked to people around the world about it, what are your takeaways?
Well, I think for starters, I really think that we need to recognize that we are just one species on this planet. And if we continue to act as though we are the only species on planet Earth, that is going to become something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so that my first takeaway is to realize that we share this planet with so many species, and we really need to look around and see consider the impact of our actions on other species. And since reporting this book, I spend so much time now trying to see the world through the eyes of other species, even if it's just like the species that are in my yard. Like I look at, the flicker that's landed in my yard, and I think like, where does that flicker build its nest, and what is it eating, and what does its daily routine look like, and what does it need? And is there something that I can provide that it's not getting, whether it's just like water or something. And so I think like that idea, like, we talk about like, oh, the bird's eye view perspective, but like, we don't ever really think about like the bird's eye view, right? Like, what does the world look like when you're a bird? And so that is my, like, I wish, like, if I have one wish for this book, it's that people read it and they try to think like, what does the world look like through the eyes of all these other species, and what do they need in their daily lives, and how can we reshape things a little bit so that they can have what they need, and that we can all kind of coexist together.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. And people can get your book at Patagonia, or probably online on the Patagonia website. Is that right?
Yes. Okay. And I think it's also in the Natural Habitat store, isn't it?
That's right, of course. Yeah, and they can go online to that gear store and get it there. In our growing library, you're our second author. You're the second author third. You're the third in our new author series. Anyways, that wraps up my questions. I'm going to hand you back to Brooke so that she can ask any audience questions. But Hillary, thank you so much. You're so articulate and smart and experienced. I'm so grateful that you came on to talk about your book and to explain it so clearly. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was great talking with you about it.
Awesome. Back to
Oh,
you.
Rachel. Good. Rachel and Hillary, that was awesome. Thank you both so much for that very great conversation. And as someone who read the book, I can totally agree and support Rachel's statement there. It is a stunningly beautiful book and it is very well written. And it is in the gear store, everybody. We are adding all author series books into the gear store for you so you can make one purchase and order all the books. We still have more to come. Don't worry, we have more to come, but you can go there and purchase Rome and join us on this conversation. So we have some questions rolling in, and if you have any more, please put them in the chat for me, and I will read them to Hillary here. So I really like this first one because I saw this with my own eyes. So there's this new technology coming out with virtual collars on cattle out in the West to remove fences. Have you heard about this? Like, did you report about it at all? And what are your thoughts on this new technology?
I did not report on it, but I have heard about it and read about it. Yeah, I mean, it seems great. There's all kinds of, I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you can make existing fences more wildlife friendly. So sometimes it's as simple as like removing a bottom rung, or making a bottom rung higher, or making a top rung lower. I think those virtual fences could be a terrific opportunity, because yeah, they keep cattle, part of the, what fencing is used for is to keep cattle in or out or whatever in one place. And so if you can do that without also, keeping wildlife from being able to cross, then that's terrific.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was just in Yellowstone, we were able to go to a ranch where they were testing this technology on their herds to see if they could keep them all in one area, which I thought was fascinating to see in person. Next question here, from your research and your time in the field, how feasible is it to create corridors, something like the Yellowstone to Yukon that's being created? Do you have any insights on that particular project? And do you think it's repeatable in other areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think Y2Y, Yellowstone to Yukon is really a phenomenal project. That is, yeah, like they've done such an incredible job of that. That is, those are giant landscapes where a lot of the land is still intact, right? Like that's what's so amazing about the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, for example, is that you have like the system is really ecologically intact, right? So you can protect it now. And so it's a similar thing across that Yellowstone to Yukon corridor. I mean, obviously there's places that are more or less developed. There are other parts of the world where you no longer can do that because there just isn't, like, a lot of the lands have already been developed and paved over. And so I think like a big conservation priority is really trying to protect these landscapes that are still intact. And so Y2Y is really like a great example of that. I do think, I mean, it's kind of what the Costa Rica project is trying to do on a much smaller scale. But of course, like they're trying to connect two areas across this valley that is very developed. And so it involves a lot of restoration rather than just protection. So I think there's two different issues that we need to think about. One is like, how can we sort of protect and connect existing landscapes while they're still open? And then the other one is how can we restore and reconnect landscapes that have been developed?
Great, thanks for that. Next here, since you did go on a global scale, what do you think might be the best way, if there's one or multiple ways, to get more wildlife corridors built on a global scale?
Well, I mean, like funding is really, I mean, that's going to be like the biggest one. Unfortunately, not to be depressing, but unfortunately, a lot of funding for wildlife conservation around the world came from the US through USAID. And so I think it was like $700 million or something in conservation funding globally came from USAID. So I think one thing to do is try to find ways to make up that money, through private foundations and whatever else, philanthropy. Like, how can we sort of make up that money? Because that's a big part of, around the globe, what these projects need is just the funds to do it. And yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff is so local in nature. So like there isn't necessarily a like one size fits all solution, because like the problems and the issues in Kenya, where I have a chapter about elephants, are very different from the problems in, northern Mexico, like the bat chapter that I was talking about. Like the themes are the same, right? The themes are, development and people's need to earn a livelihood, and public versus private lands, and the themes are the same, but the actual like on the ground issues are not the same. But I do think like in a lot of cases it requires money, government input in some way, and then like champions, like these kind of local heroes and volunteers who are willing to do the actual work.
Great, thank you. Next, this is a good and thoughtful question, and really thought-provoking question. What role do our public lands play in all of this? And with all of the recent political upheaval that was happening with the potential sell-off of our public lands, did you report on or see a resistance to this? So it's kind of a big question all in one. Why do we need our public lands? And why would it be really scary if we lost them?
Yeah, I mean, I think, public lands are essential, right? Like they're the sort of backbone of all this. That is the land that we have set aside from development. That is the land that we have sort of said, like, this is where non-human species can exist, right? Like this is the sort of land that's for them. We need more than just that, but that is where so much happens. And that's where, I talk about this idea of umbilical connectivity and this human connection to nature. Like those public lands are where a lot of that happens, whether it's just someone going out for like a short hike, or whether it's someone going backpacking or camping or fishing or hunting or whatever it is. Like that is where a lot of that connection to nature happens, is on our public lands. It was really heartening to see like how swift, like of all the stuff that was going on at that time, the most like visceral and swift response, I think, was when people felt that their public lands were really at risk. And I think Americans like stepped up and sort of showed, we do not want our public lands sold off and developed and used for other things. So yeah, I think that's just like a sort of essence of like the American idea, and we need to not lose those. But also we need more than just those public lands.
Fantastic. Yes. And last question, I was going to wrap it up, but this one is too good to pass up. So have you seen more interest around the world for wildlife corridors in dense urban areas, like famous P22 in LA, the cougar? Are you seeing that? Is that a global phenomenon?
I don't know if it's a global phenomenon yet, but I definitely think, what's cool about, so one thing that's happening in LA is like the biggest wildlife overpass in the world, I think, is under construction there and almost done. It's crosses the Ventura Freeway there. It's called the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing. And what's cool about those wildlife crossing structures is that they're so visible. And so it's this really, really visible way to understand the concept of connectivity. And so I think like the more those proliferate, the more people understand, oh, right, wait a minute, this road that is connecting me to where I need to go is actually disconnecting all these other species from where they need to go. And so I think that those are proliferating around the world for sure. And I think the idea of wildlife corridors is definitely spreading, including to cities. But I don't know if it's like quite a huge global phenomenon yet, but I hope it will be soon.
Yes, agreed. It reminds me of one of our next author books that are coming up, everybody. If you're interested, you want a sneak peek, it's called Crossings by Ben Goldfarb. And it is a wonderful book. And it takes this topic and goes a little bit more in depth into what Hillary was just talking about. So that'd be a great follow-up to this discussion. And it's also in the Gear Store. So order both.
It's an awesome
order
book.
both books. Oh, and Ben is amazing too. It'll be great. All of you will meet him soon. But with that, all right, we have reached the top of the hour here. So Hillary and Rachel, if either of you have last minute closing comments, please, by all means, share them with us now. We would love to hear what you would have to say before we leave.
I just want to say thanks again to Hillary. It's just been so great to hear from you. And I'm so glad you're out there writing about this really important topic in such an accessible and interesting way.
Thank you. Well, yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been great to have a chance to talk about the book, and I hope people will read it and go out and see the world through the eyes of non-human species. So thank you.
Yes, and thank you both so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I would like to thank everybody who tuned in. Again, if you would like to purchase a copy of Rome, check out the NatHab Gear Store on our website. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at 800-543-8917 or send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are more than happy to help you. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation and the replay will be available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.